I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional country of the Ngunnawal peoples and pay respect to elders past and present. I recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. I also extend respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. This year's CIW annual lecture is made possible with support from the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. The Australian Centre on China and the World is a recipient of the Foundation's annual grants program to build Australia's knowledge capability by preparing students from Australian universities around the country for advanced degrees in China studies, and to bring in international specialists such as the guest speaker we have here tonight delivering the annual lecture, for extended visits as part of a high-profile visiting fellowship scheme, which we are very, very proud to host. So it's my pleasure, first of all, to invite Mr. Gary Cowan, CEO of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, to say a few words. Welcome, Gary.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Gary Cowan. I'm the CEO of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, and thank you first to Ben and the Centre for the invitation tonight, and let me echo Ben's acknowledgement of country. I really want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting tonight, the Ngunnawal people, and pay respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to other families with a connection to these lands and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us this evening. And it is a real pleasure to be with you this evening to welcome Dr. Scott Kennedy to deliver the 2024 Centre on China in the World annual lecture. Scott hails from the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, DC. He there is a senior advisor and also the chair in Chinese business and economics. He's really a world-leading expert on the Chinese economy, U.S. China commercial relations, and many other aspects of those areas. He's been a very regular traveller to China for, I think, nearly 4 decades. So there's a lot of expertise that he brings and the ability to communicate it. Many of you, I think, will have read his material or heard his podcast, China Field Notes, online, but it's a great pleasure to have him in person with us here tonight and indeed for the next month. Scott joins an impressive list of previous speakers in this annual lecture series, including, of course, Professor Jeremy Barmay, who was the foundation head of the Centre on China in the World, very famous sinologist, and he gave the inaugural lecture in 2011. In that lecture, Jeremy explored what it was to be China literate, and he put a lot of weight on our ability to think about, engage within, and contend with a China that is itself a world of complexity. That literacy, growing it, sustaining it, and drawing on it to inform Australia's engagement with China is, I think, as important now as it was in 2011, and arguably much more so. So the Foundation is pleased to be partnering with the Centre on China in the World to, in a common cause really, to improve Australia's China knowledge and capability. Our practical effort on this front with CIW has 2 parts. One of those, Ben mentioned, we were very pleased to support the Centre on China in the World's Honours Advanced Preparation Program. So in early July, we sponsored a program here to encourage bright, enthusiastic young Australian students to dedicate themselves and their careers to understanding China. The second part is this one. We are sponsoring, I guess, a program that is going to bring two internationally renowned scholars on China here to Canberra at CIW in 2024 and 2025. Because onshoring ideas from outside Australia does enliven our discussions on China and informs our engagement with it. And we were really enthused when Ben proposed Scott Kennedy as the first international fellow. Few can speak with Scott's authority on China's economy, its industrial policies, its technological rise, and the potential consequences for the United States and well beyond. Scott, I think, is also keenly interested in the question of China literacy, growing it, sustaining it, and using it, in his case, to inform American engagement with China. I really look forward to Scott's remarks tonight, and congratulations to Ben Hillman and the team here at CIW for the initiative. Thank you. And welcome, Scott.
Well, thank you so much for that really warm introduction and welcome. It is a distinct honor to be here tonight to talk with everybody about issues that I think everyone in the room cares about. But let me particularly thank Gary and the Foundation for supporting my trip and this improving my literacy about China and what's going on there and its place in the world. His team, Josh Armstrong, Simon Smith, really helpful in putting together a fulsome program. Anyone that thinks I'm on vacation this month is wrong. He's ensuring that's the case. And so they've provided a great warm welcome to me. Also thank you to Ben and to the center here, Sharon, Nancy, Melody, the rest of the team have made me feel at home during this time here. And when you travel a lot, the ability to make you feel like you fit in or that you can get stuff done and you're not just a stranger is really important. That's extremely valuable. And I'm also grateful, before I left, a few days before, I had breakfast with Ambassador Rudd in Washington and mentioned that I was coming. And he was kind enough to remind me of his small little role in creating this institution. And I appreciated that. And he's also helps educate me about China literacy all the time. And I'm going to go back and tell him and report on this visit to him. I'm also really grateful because I really just wanted to escape Washington, D.C. And it is too hot, the politics are too gross, and I just needed to get as far away as I possibly could. Apparently, you all still like to talk about Donald Trump. And so I might need to go even further away. But I actually really like this weather. I've heard that people think it's cold and it's winter. This is like fantastic for me. So this is just really, I'm very appreciative. I'm not sure I'm actually worthy to give this lecture. Because I'm not an academic. I work in a think tank, and the others who have given these talks have been very well-seasoned, smart scholars who do fabulous work. And I don't know if I can compete with any of them. Let me see here if I can make this work. I've got a couple slides. I work on technology. I just don't know how to use it. So I'm not a classically trained sinologist. So I can't read calligraphy. Gary did mention there are things that I do. I work on the economy, and I travel and things like that. And so, I've been traveling China for a long time. You can tell that the film technology has gotten worse over time because on the right side, it's expanded everything. It makes it look wider. This is in Datong, if you would know. I've done lots of this. I want to make you jealous. Well, I'll try not to make you jealous by showing you all the food that I had when I was in quarantine. I did 26 days of quarantine to get back into China during the pandemic because I needed the alone time. Or actually, more accurately, my wife needed the alone time. I'm not going to talk and show you lots of pictures of people I've interviewed and places I've gone, although I've done that, and we could have lots of slides on that. I'm not going to show you all the cool cars that I've test driven or written about, and there's just way too many models and brands. And I'm not going to show you a lot of data because I don't want to scramble your brains. You don't ever give people too much data. And I'm not going to show you a lot of family pictures because that would be unfair and would defeat the purpose of this trip. Although several of my family members are going to be here in a couple days, and they are going to enjoy your hospitality as well. So today, I'm not going to do any of that. Instead, this is going to be a rumination. I'm not going to be talking about Chinese EVs and technology policy and things like that at the beginning. If you want to, we can get into that. Instead, I'm going to talk about a puzzle that I've been thinking about for several years, since at least 2019. And I don't have writer's block, but I have brain block. I'm having a difficult time putting all of this together. And so I've written a few small little pieces about the topic tonight, but I've not written the big thing. And unfortunately, there's someone in Gary's role in a foundation that has been waiting for a long time for this thing. But I've held off writing it because I can't decide what my real opinion is. And so I'm hoping that tonight we can ruminate together about this problem. I want to dedicate tonight's talk to two people, and excuse me. The first is my mom, who's no longer with us. She was not a big fan of China. She was not a big fan of me traveling to China. She was a business person, and it's one reason I am so fascinated with business people and spend time studying them. But she means a lot to me and is a big reason why I focus on my work as hard as I do. And if I talk more about her, we'll have to end this. And we'll need that aide person who's here, and we don't want that. The second person I want to dedicate tonight's talk to is someone who I was really hoping to see here on this trip, who's also not with us any longer, Professor Susan Seld, who was my advisor when I was a grad student at George Washington University, working on my PhD, and who, after I left GW, decided that she needed to also go someplace else, and so she came here and spread her knowledge and love with everyone here. And I got to tell you, I have had some great China experts to learn from, but they can't hold a candle to Susan. In my dissertation proposal defense, and my dissertation was about business lobbying in China, and I was studying industry associations and how they aggregate interests or don't aggregate interests and how they get stuff done, and comparing one sector to another. And I presented my framework, and I was going to compare this industry to that industry. And Susan, in her very nice, genuinely curious way, said, "So what?" Why do you care that in some associations, some industries, they might be well organized and others, they might not? And I thought first, damn, that's a hard question. But it's the exact right question. And I had the second half of my dissertation just because of her question. So important. And it wouldn't have been a book, and I wouldn't have done all the interesting things I did if she didn't just use that 15 seconds to ask me. And she asked it in the genuinely nice way. It wasn't the, I'm the smart person in the room and I'm going to show you you're dumb. It was genuine curiosity, just too important. So I want to recognize her and her. And when I accepted this invitation in December, I was really looking forward to seeing her. So I just want to let you all know that she's in my thoughts, and I know in yours as well. That is the end of my slides. I have no more slides, and because if power corrupts, PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. And so I am not going to use it any further. And what I want to talk today to you about is this puzzle of how we are supposed to deal with China, with this challenge. In Washington, D.C., you'll hear that there is a consensus there about how to deal with China from both Republicans and Democrats. And people will tell you that they disagree on many issues, but on China policy, they agree. Hawks, like from the Select Committee on Competition with the CCP, issued a report in December last year with 200 plus recommendations, and they emphasized that this was a bipartisan report. You may read the journal Foreign Affairs, and a few weeks ago there was an essay by Matt Pottinger, former Deputy National Security Advisor, an essay he wrote with Mike Gallagher, one of the members of that committee who has since left Congress and gone into business. In that essay, they also emphasize that everyone is on the same page on China. Biden officials also claim that there is a consensus about how to deal with China. One of the former Biden officials from the National Security Council, Rush Doshi, who is now at the Council on Foreign Relations, has highlighted this. He just started a China Initiative program at CFR, and the big message from the launch of that initiative was that everyone is in consensus about the problem. There's minor differences over the tactics needed to address the problem. So I would say, yes, there has been a narrowing of differences, and that is because of how China has changed under the leadership of Xi Jinping. Everybody recognizes now that China is a giant challenge where there needs to be pushback. And if you can do it with friends, that would be a bonus. We're overexposed, we're vulnerable, we face a whole variety of risks, and something needs to be done. But my sense from working on this problem a long time is that that is as far as the consensus goes. Short-term management of the problem. That's it. I think it's interesting. I think we might ask, why are people asserting that there is a consensus? I think hawks want to assert that there is a consensus because they want everyone to agree with them that everyone should take a hawkish approach towards China. And that if you don't, you're weak. I think folks that are more in the middle want to say that there's a consensus because they don't want anyone challenging them that they may be soft on China. We're tough too. Don't question that we're tough. So I think there's a lot of motives for folks to claim there's a consensus even though there's not. There's a whole long list of things over which there is no consensus. Is the source of the problem Xi Jinping's leadership or the fact that the Communist Party is in power? There's no consensus on that. Was the integration project to have China join the WTO and other international institutions and develop connectivity through engagement, was that misguided? Was that a loser's bet? What are China's intentions today? Is it aiming to make the world safe for authoritarian mercantilist states? Or is it trying to promote its model even in countries that don't share its preferences? Or is it just trying to get along and it's totally misunderstood? Is it a revisionist power? Does China have any good ideas which we might want to adopt? Another question about China is, will it always be this way? Will it always be run by a hard-line, conservative oligarch? Or is it subject to change? And under what conditions might it change? Does Xi Jinping have to get hit by an electric vehicle for it to change? Or might it change even while he's still in power? So those are questions we don't know about China. There's a lot of questions we don't know about ourselves. Has the U.S. and the West contributed at all to the problem? Or is it 100% China's fault? Can we admit that there might even be a little bit of responsibility on the other side, on our side? I know when you're in China, they say it's 100% our fault. I hear that time and again. But if it's the responsibility of both sides, then it's not necessarily the product of just one institutional system or another. It's a relationship issue. And then it's about how to manage that relationship. And having been married for 33 years, that's hard. I know that's hard. What's the U.S.'s goal? What's Australia's goal? What's victory look like for this quote-unquote strategic competition? How important are allies? Are allies so important there's some things we're not willing to do? Or are allies not as important on some issues that we're willing to leave them on the sides? Are we willing to throw away the rules-based order because there's some things that are so important in terms of responding to Chinese behavior that we're just willing to dismiss the WTO or international security arrangements because the challenge is so daunting and pressing and urgent? How important are other goals besides national security? Is now not a time to focus any longer on economic growth? Is climate just less important because it's less urgent? We'll get to that down the road. What costs are we willing to bear in terms of slower growth or warmer planet in order to deal with this challenge? Do we need to persuade the public to come along with us? If we do we need to show them any evidence that there's a giant problem and that it's all China's fault or that both sides are to blame? I don't know about you, but working in Washington without a security clearance, I got to tell you this, the evidence on specific kinds of things isn't shared with the public. And I pay extremely close attention. Is there a responsibility to share more with the public? And lastly, given all that, what the hell should we do? I don't think we have a full strategy right now. We have a short-term management approach. Why are these differences existing? Why haven't we been able to answer these questions? I think it's partly we haven't asked these questions because it's inconvenient to ask these questions. But I think it's also because China is a hard place to understand. There's variation within China. There's changes over time. We're exposed to China differently, right? The American profile, only 9% of trade with China, lots in high tech. Australia, a much higher percentage of trade, but more in minerals and resources. That's a different exposure pattern, different kinds of challenges. We have different domestic politics. I don't think you want American domestic politics. But I'm told I don't want Australian domestic politics, taken back to the U.S. But anyway, those domestic politics matter in how you conceive of the challenge, what are the highest priorities, how you respond. And lastly, China treats countries differently. The way China is dealing with the EU on EV tariffs, basically going bonkers over what the EU has done in a very methodical, legal-oriented way, compared to how they responded to the US, which was just slap on some tariffs with no foundation and basically not pay attention to that. Those different kinds of responses, different kinds of ways the Chinese are treating. I believe that Chinese Premier Li Qiang was just here recently, and he declared everything's fine in Australia-China relations. I don't think that's the answer that he got back, but that's not the message that Li Qiang would have been giving had he gone to Washington, D.C. or to Brussels. So the Chinese are treating countries differently. So I think these things explain some of the differences and why we're having trouble answering those questions. Those questions, for me, because are most applicable to our economic relationship with China, which is not now primarily about market access or even fair trade, although that's part of it. Now it falls under the larger rubric of economic security. You know, at CSIS, where I work, we have about 300 people in a nice big building that cost $100 million. And we pursued the Chinese local government strategy. We issued a lot of debt for the building. It's a very nice building, and I really love being there. When I started, we had 3 people working full-time on China. Just 3. All right. Now we have 12 full-time people on China. And we have 288 people working part-time on China, because everybody works on China. Doesn't matter whether you're in the Middle East studies or energy or defense or this technology or that technology. Everyone's using at least half of their brain to think about China. And at CSIS, we're the shopping mall of think tanks. We have 36 programs that don't coordinate with each other, and we're all writing and speaking this cacophony of voices that looks very nice from the outside because we have a cool website. But it's a lot of different voices on these issues. We've taken one little step to address this by just a few weeks ago creating an economic security and technology department and hiring a president to head that, someone who was senior in the Biden administration's Commerce Department. We're trying to figure this out. And it's not just left to me any longer. It's a whole variety of problems that fall under the rubric of economic security and challenges. Broadly speaking, China's non-market economy, because of state intervention and subsidies, efforts to change international rules to align with that approach, add in strategic competition with the United States and the West, and potential conflicts in the South China Sea, Taiwan, elsewhere, using technology that might come out of connectivity with the rest of the world. That's sort of the broader challenge that China's system and its relationship with us present, but there's very specific areas in economic security that people are anxious about. Who's winning in tech? You know, all areas of tech. And I think ASPE, a think tank here in Canberra, is very famous for showing how China is winning in, 37 of 41 areas of technology. But everyone has their indices and markers, and we can talk about that if you want. It's a broader question about economic competitiveness and macroeconomic imbalances, things that are related to the economic foundations of your industries and your power. Dual-use technologies, working on a civilian and commercial side and things going out the back door to help the military. Data security, supply chain resilience, critical infrastructure, economic coercion, financial security, human rights, the application of technologies that in ways that might violate human rights. These are all giant problems that the U.S. and the rest of the world is grappling with in our relationship with China, and it's why we have so many more dang people at CSIS and everywhere paying attention to these problems. Now, we've mostly talked about, now I want to talk about what are we going to do about it. The first approach that we've originally thought that would work was patient engagement. The idea that you could integrate China into the rest of the world and it would not become like everybody else, but it would become close enough that you could manage the cooperation and manage the differences through a common set of rules. But that integration approach is lost all political favor everywhere. I don't think any country is saying that their goal right now is to engage with China to get them to operate more consistently in line with international rules and norms, or use those rules that exist to manage the differences with China. Instead, we've been pursuing and thinking about pursuing two other strategies. The first is to isolate and weaken China, to contain and decouple, or as the Chinese say, contain, surround, and suppress. And that has drawn a lot of favor in certain capitals and by certain experts. Now, the Biden administration is not pursuing that policy, even though you often hear folks in Beijing assert that that is the case. The Biden administration is pursuing a path of what they call competition without conflict, but doing so in a way that is highly consistent and drawing on the ideas of the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who emphasizes with regard to economic security this idea of de-risking and not decoupling. Now, the toolkit for de-risking, small yards, high fences, with defensive measures, industrial policy, actually looks a lot like the tools that one would use for decoupling and containing, but less drastic. My view is that there is a significant difference in goals and in the intensity of these tools, but there's still big problems with this latter approach. I favor it relative to decoupling and containing, or patient engagement, which is a naive mission which would not work now, especially in the face of the kinds of challenges that I described. But the approach of de-risking ain't enough. We got to do better than that. If you only focus on the de-risking, then you may not be able to actually manage the level of restrictions that are imposed, because it's not only up to you. You have other countries participating, including the Chinese, and you can get tit for tat back and forth with the Chinese, or you can get other countries joining in, because remember, this world has 190 some odd countries on the planet, and so as you've seen EV measures imposed, you've seen other countries follow, and that's leading others in this game of protectionist musical chairs, and you might end up with more restrictions than you originally planned. So your small yard may not end up being so small, and your fence may be higher than you wanted, and you may need more of them. Not out of your original intention, but just the dynamics of how countries interact with each other. Can you ensure that China is going to be more isolated and weaker as a result of these strategies? Can you ensure that they won't work their ways around these restrictions and end up stronger as a result? Are we not suppressing? Are we incentivizing? These problems with the de-risking strategy and with the effort to contain or decouple share a common problem, at least as I have been thinking about it. Their intellectual weakness is that they misunderstand interdependence. They see interdependence only as a risk, only as a vulnerability, and that China is the only side that has the ability to utilize interdependence to its favor. And hence, the strategy is the less you're connected, the safer you are. That's the basic mathematical equation of either the second or the third approach. My view is that that's wrong, that is just an inaccurate conclusion of the value of interdependence, and that it's been thrown aside too quickly without recognizing what's being lost in the process. Interdependence not only provides opportunities for greater economic growth and development, it also provides ways for us to deal with climate change and to decarbonize. But more important than that, it has multiple benefits for national security. And that's where the argument's going to be won or lost. You're not going to win an argument with folks in Washington, Canberra, Brussels, Berlin, Tokyo, or anywhere else by saying national security is less important than growth and the climate. What you have to do is take on, head on, the issue about national security. And that's really the insight that I'm trying to offer and that I've been wondering about for a while. So why on earth would Scott be a dumbass and say that interdependence helps national security? Well, let me give you several reasons. First is the most traditional, which is interdependence raises the costs of conflict for all parties. Why is China not gone to war with the Philippines? Why are they tiptoeing around, even though aggressively? Why have they not invaded Taiwan? Why have they not given massive military aid to Russia over Ukraine? Because the cost to them would be absolutely astronomical. The U.S., and I hope Australia and others, would immediately put massive, massive sanctions on China. We would make their banks unable to do international business. We would throw tariffs up to a gajillion percent. We would kick Chinese out of the United States and maybe Australia. There is so many ways that we would immediately try to weaken their economy. What the U.S. has been doing with allies with regard to Ukraine and Russia is practice for what we would do with regard to Taiwan. I have no doubt that if there's a war over Taiwan or something close to it, the level of economic sanctions would be astronomical. And the Chinese know that. And the Chinese know that because they are interdependent with us, because the costs to them are only high because we are interdependent. Interdependence also has kept China dependent on our technology across many, many different spheres. Yes, the Chinese have used this connectivity to get ahead and advance and develop, but in almost every ecosystem, the West has managed also to continue to progress and to continue to have the Chinese be important consumers of their technology. Remember, a friend of mine who works for a semiconductor company that went to China to start providing business in the mid-90s reminded me that their goal was to get China addicted to their semiconductors, and that they successfully did that, and that the Chinese came to them and said, gosh, we need to innovate. What could we do? Well, okay, let's work on a word processing software that we can use and not have to use Microsoft Office. Go ahead, right? That's just some application. Much more important is who's controlling upper end of technology. And being a reliable supplier of technology to China has made it dependent and very difficult to break away from that technology, even if they want to, because not only is that technology good, the network effects that come with using these types of interconnected technologies raises the costs even higher from whether or not it's difficult for on one device, for example. So there's a benefit from being a dependable supplier of technologies to your opponent. It also helps you innovate. The money that you get from selling in China for some companies is huge, which is plowed back to into their R&D. In addition, by being in China, it's such a competitive market. It's, as Jörg Wuttke, the former president of the European Chamber of Commerce in China, said, the world's best fitness center for companies to be trained on how to innovate, how to make their products better, how to provide service, because if you can do it in China, you can do it anywhere, as Frank Sinatra said. It also allows you, this connectivity allows you to benchmark Chinese capabilities. If you're all here, if you're only in the United States, if you're only in Europe and you're not in China, you can't benchmark what they can do. You don't know what they can do. But if you're in business with them every day, planning, collaborating, you know exactly what the Chinese are capable of and what they're not capable of. And that knowledge is as valuable as who's ahead and who's behind. Supply chain resilience. China can be part of a supply chain resilience solution. In the United States, we complained bitterly that in the early parts of the pandemic, we could not get PPT from China. So people said, well, geez, we should just all build it here at home and just make it here. Well, that would be great, but let's say we had it all in Texas. Well, in the winter of 2020 in Texas, the lights went out because Texas has this really antiquated power grid and no one was producing jack squat in Texas for several months. So the story of supply chain resilience is diversification. You don't need 95% of stuff from China, but you need something from China that might help. Chinese talent. Our universities, labs, companies, governments are way, way smarter and way more capable because we have attracted Chinese talent to our communities, where they stay once they finish and contribute in schools. Absolutely critical. This is a talent competition. We are winning. And why would you want to steal defeat from the jaws of victory? That's a really, really dumb idea. And that is because of the interdependence. Pathways of communication. You can't talk to people and solve a crisis or avoid a crisis or manage the consequences of one unless you have communities of people to be connected to. That's partly by living on the ground in both places, by traveling, going to conferences, having coffee during conferences, going even out to bars or golf courses, critical sources, areas of research and collaboration, in my experience. And so those human connections are really vital. Finally, I think by being connected to China and interdependent, you are fostering the most pro-engagement internationalists in China, in business, in government, in academia. When you're disconnected, they are weaker. They are less powerful inside their own system. The pandemic was a perfect opportunity for hawks, who are very uncomfortable with the international order and the international rules of the game, to not have to pay any attention to it. And it meant they didn't have to invite to all of their meetings people in China who know a lot about the rest of the world. And the same thing happened in DC. There was no need to invite China experts to meetings in DC for a long time because we didn't have squat to contribute to those meetings because we hadn't traveled, we hadn't talked to people. And so the lack of connectivity has huge negative consequences on those who want to figure out how to solve problems. So what do we do about it? And I'm sorry that I'm droning on for what must seem like an eternity, but I'm laying out for you my argument as best I can about what I think we ought to do. I think any strategy that begins with the word D is a bad strategy. And I don't mean the letter D. I mean DE hyphen. We got to have an affirmative strategy, not decoupling, not de-risking, not de-whatever. We need something positive to aim for. So that's why I've come up with this term, calibrated coupling. I think we need to evaluate the economic tasks at hand. Where are we ahead? Where are we behind? What are our strengths and what are our weaknesses? And identify and figure out how to respond to the risks that we face. Insurance companies, airlines, doctors, all are really good at figuring out how to manage risks. You have duplicative processes, you have stockpiles, you have people check each other. There's so many good ways to manage risk, which we are doing. But on the other side, we need to utilize the interdependence to our advantage and calibrate the relationship in a way that allows us to maximize China's dependence on us and build those linkages that help expand the benefits economically in terms of national security for this relationship. One of the best examples of a place that is using this strategy is Taiwan. Taiwan has imposed significant limits on commercial interaction with China. Most inward investment from the PRC into Taiwan is blocked or highly limited. 25% of Taiwan's tariff lines are off limits to imports from China. If you work in a high-tech company in Taiwan, you're basically export controlled and have a very difficult time working for a PRC company. On the other hand, Taiwan is highly interconnected and dependent with the PRC. 35% of their exports go there. Hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese go back and forth and work in firms in Taiwan, in China. And this is not just good economic strategy for Taiwan. Taiwan would not be the powerhouse it is today without that connectivity correctly calibrated. It is an intentional national security strategy for the Taiwanese, who have said explicitly that their goal of this connectivity is strategic indispensability. They want to make sure they are so important to the PRC that the costs of going to war are almost unimaginable. That's exactly why they are so focused on maintaining their advantages in semiconductor manufacturing. There are lots of other places that this can apply. And I just got a couple more points to make and then look forward to your feedback. One industry where we in the West are ahead is in biopharmaceuticals. Washington, D.C., earlier this year, in February, a senator from Michigan put forward a sponsored piece of legislation called the BioSecure Act. The BioSecure Act would essentially ban clinical trials between American big pharma and Chinese providers. They're worried that the data from these clinical trials would end up on Xi Jinping's iPad and in the labs of Chinese scientists who would then create bioweapons. Now, there are real risks with clinical trials, with the safety of and efficacy of drugs. And even though you may think bioweapons is some kind of like science fiction, there's people who are very smart who think that these are real things to worry about. But there are ways to mitigate those risks and also take advantage of this collaboration with China. When I was there in March, I visited a friend of mine who I've known for a very long time, a former professor at Indiana University, a chemist, who left IU to work at Eli Lilly in Indianapolis, who went back to China in 2005, opened up a clinical research organization for Big Pharma in Kunshan, and did very well. So well that he took the company public, sold it, and now he doesn't ever have to worry about his financial future again. He then was attracted to go invest in Wuhan, ironically, which has a huge biopharma sector called Guanggu, in the southeast side, and I was there this spring. And he has a new company called Waterstone. Why would he name it Waterstone? Well, traditional Chinese culture, right? No. His neighborhood where he lived in Indianapolis was Waterstone, so he named the company Waterstone. So again, you have to not always be so psyched up about the Chinese culture stuff. It's not necessarily what motivates people. He is doing world-class research on cancer drugs. And if my friend can help solve cancer, I don't care if it comes from his company or from Pfizer or from somebody else's. So to me, that's a national security benefit that we all ought to be welcoming. There are certain risks that we need to take regarding to protecting data, but these type of collaborations are absolutely vital. A sector where we're not ahead, and then I'll be done and shut up. Electric vehicles. China has provided huge subsidies. We've done the math on this. You can go on our website, and I threw some up there. $230 billion in subsidies at least over the last 10 years. But their cars also are very good. And we just issued a podcast this morning in Washington, D.C., where I interviewed Michael Lasky from AVL List, an Austrian auto consulting company. He lives in Shanghai, has been there for several decades. He knows more about the Chinese auto sector than almost anybody I've ever met. And he has watched and helped make the Chinese auto sector what it is today with other companies and other partnerships. And in the podcast, and sorry for the advertising, he highlights how the Chinese have done this. It's not just that they make cheap cars because of subsidies. There's serious quality benefits, and he says if the Western automakers want to have a competitive auto sector down the road, they better be in China. If you're not in China, you are not collaborating with who you need to collaborate with to stay ahead. And you better let Chinese companies into your market. Because if you don't, you're not going to be putting pressure on your auto sectors and helping the supply chains grow, because they're not going to be competing with the best. So, should we have all-out bans on importing Chinese cars? I think we ought to think twice about that. Certainly, countervailing duties, anti-dumping measures to deal with explicit subsidies make sense. But maybe we ought to think about the EU approach, which is simultaneously encouraging investment in the EU as a way to have technology transfer, jobs for folks that live in the EU, given how high unemployment is there, and watch that sector develop. The wild card here is that an electric vehicle or an internal combustion vehicle is a cell phone on wheels. They all collect data, they all transmit data. So in the U.S., we just put forward a draft executive order about connected vehicles, and we're going to have to figure out what to do about the data that cars collect and transmit, because it is a massive amount of data. There are thousands of chips in every vehicle. But this is not just a problem for Chinese participants in this supply chain. General Motors also collects data on Americans. And if you just go back a couple months ago, the New York Times had a wonderful article about how General Motors is abusing their collection of this data to do all sorts of stuff with your data and sell it to all different kinds of people. Now, I don't know if they're putting that in their GM cars they sell here, or if anyone here wants a GM car, But in the United States, they sell a bunch, and that's a big challenge. So this is not a China-specific problem. Just like social media is not just a TikTok problem. It is a every company problem. And so part of that may be about special rules related to companies from China, but it is also about rules that we need for these industries, data-intensive industries as a whole. Will calibrated coupling result in a change in China? No. It's not going to change because of this, but it will slow the spiral, and we can use the advantages of interdependence to promote our economy and our security and our values and try to develop the world that we want. It may not work. We may have to change our approach. We may have to put aside our values. We may have to put aside some of the current rules of the system. And China will play a critical role in that, because if it doesn't react well to this approach, things will get worse. And it has 100% say in what it does. So this is not just about the U.S. and the West. But I think it's worth doing, even if it's risky, because at the end of the day, what we also need to do is very simply play for time. We need to develop strategies that can last as long as possible, they're effective as long as possible, because we don't know which direction China is going to go. It could get worse, it could get better, but one of the things I know as a China specialist that my fellow China specialists here know is that China never goes in a straight line for very long. So we have to be prepared to wait this out and then see where China goes. And then if we need, we'll adjust again. Thank you very much.